The pieces are already in motion, and most Americans have no idea what's actually at stake. Right now, the United States is being maneuvered into the most consequential geopolitical trap of the 21st century, one that could fundamentally reshape American power, drain our treasury, and potentially spark a conflict that makes Ukraine look like a preview. Taiwan isn't just another flashpoint on the map. It's the ultimate pressure point in a carefully orchestrated strategy that's been decades in the making. Think about it. We've committed ourselves to defending an island 7,000 miles away, right off the coast of a nuclear superpower with the world's largest navy, while our own military-industrial complex salivates at the prospect of another endless confrontation. But here's what the defense contractors and think tank experts won't tell you. The moment China makes its move on Taiwan, whether through blockade, invasion, or reunification by other means, the trap doesn't just spring shut on Taiwan. It springs shut on us. Our semiconductor supply chains get severed. Our naval forces get stretched to the breaking point. Our economy, already buckling under unprecedented debt, faces a crisis that could make 2008 look like a minor correction. And while we're focused on the South China Sea, our global position deteriorates everywhere else simultaneously. Let me be absolutely clear about something that should concern every American paying attention to what's unfolding in the Pacific right now. We're watching the construction of a strategic mousetrap, and the cheese has been placed so carefully, so deliberately, that our entire foreign policy establishment is practically racing to step into it. Taiwan has become the single most dangerous geopolitical trigger point on the planet, and the tragedy is that this didn't have to be our problem. But we've made it our problem, and in doing so, we've handed our adversaries exactly the scenario they need to fundamentally alter the global balance of power. You see, what makes this situation so insidious is that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and each level reinforces the trap. On the surface, we have the moral argument, defending democracy, standing up to authoritarianism, protecting a free people from aggression. These are powerful narratives, and they resonate deeply with American values. But beneath that surface layer, there's a cold, hard strategic reality that has nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with semiconductors, naval dominance, and the architecture of global trade. And beneath even that, there's a financial dimension that almost nobody wants to discuss publicly because it reveals just how precarious our entire economic system has become. Let's start with the technology question, because this is what most people focus on when they think about why Taiwan matters. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces roughly 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of the most advanced chips. These aren't just components for your smartphone or laptop. These are the brains of everything from fighter jets to missile defense systems, from artificial intelligence to autonomous vehicles, from data centers to satellite networks. The entire digital infrastructure of modern civilization runs on chips that are primarily manufactured on an island that's 100 miles from mainland China. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. We've allowed the most critical technology of the 21st century to be concentrated in the most geopolitically vulnerable location imaginable. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of decades of decisions driven by corporate profit margins and the beautiful theory of economic interdependence that dominated thinking after the Cold War. The idea was that if we made everyone dependent on everyone else through global supply chains, war would become economically irrational. And you know what? That theory might have worked if everyone was playing by the same rules and had the same objectives. But they're not, and they don't. China looked at this interdependence and saw leverage. They saw that by allowing the West to become dependent on manufacturing concentrated in their sphere of influence, they were gaining strategic power that could be weaponized at the moment of their choosing. Now, the United States has recognized this vulnerability, which is why we're spending billions trying to build semiconductor manufacturing capacity back home through the CHIPS Act. But here's the problem. Building cutting-edge chip fabrication plants takes years, requires expertise that's largely concentrated in Taiwan, and costs astronomical sums of money. We're talking about facilities that cost $20 billion each and require technological knowledge that you can't just download or reverse engineer quickly. Even if everything goes perfectly, we're looking at the end of this decade before we have meaningful domestic production of advanced semiconductors. In other words, for at least the next 5 years, we remain critically dependent on Taiwan, and China knows this better than anyone. But the semiconductor issue, as critical as it is just one dimension of the trap. The naval and military dimension is equally important and potentially more dangerous. The United States has been the dominant naval power in the Pacific since 1945. That dominance has guaranteed freedom of navigation, protected trade routes, and maintained a security architecture that has prevented major wars in the region for nearly 80 years. But maintaining that dominance requires the ability to project power throughout the region, and Taiwan sits right in the middle of what's called the First Island Chain, that string of islands from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines that forms a natural barrier containing Chinese naval power. If China gains control of Taiwan, that entire strategic geometry changes overnight. Suddenly, Chinese naval and air forces have direct access to the Pacific Ocean without having to navigate through narrow straits that we can monitor and, if necessary, blockade. The People's Liberation Army Navy, which is already the largest navy in the world by number of ships, would have ports and bases that allow them to operate freely in what has been American-dominated waters for generations. Our bases in Japan, in South Korea, in Guam, all of them become more vulnerable, more exposed, more difficult to resupply in a crisis. And here's where the trap really starts to reveal itself. If China moves on Taiwan, whether through outright invasion, through a blockade, or through some other form of coercion, the United States faces an impossible choice. Do we intervene militarily to prevent Chinese control of the island, knowing that this means direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed peer competitor in their near abroad, where they have every geographic and logistical advantage? Or do we stand aside, accept the loss of Taiwan, and watch as our entire alliance structure in Asia collapses, because our partners conclude that American security guarantees are worthless? This is not a theoretical dilemma. This is a choice that could materialize within the next few years, possibly even sooner. And either option leads to disaster for American interests. If we fight, we risk a war that could escalate beyond anyone's control, that would devastate our economy, that would require a mobilization of resources and national will that I'm not convinced the American public is prepared for. If we don't fight, we accept a historic defeat that signals the end of American primacy in the Pacific and probably accelerates the unraveling of our global position everywhere else. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely our military can handle this. We have the most powerful military in human history. We spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. But military power isn't just about total spending or overall capability. It's about what you can bring to bear in a specific theater at a specific time. And in the Taiwan scenario, we would be fighting 7,000 miles from our shores against an adversary that's operating in their backyard. Every ship, every plane, every missile we deploy has to cross the Pacific Ocean. Every wounded soldier needs to be evacuated across that same ocean. Every replacement part, every gallon of fuel, every bullet has to travel that distance. China, meanwhile, can operate from bases on the mainland. They can use shore-based anti-ship missiles that cost a fraction of what our ships cost, but can sink those ships just as effectively. They can employ thousands of drones, both aerial and naval, in swarm attacks that could overwhelm our defenses. They can launch cyber attacks that could disrupt our communications, our logistics, our ability to coordinate operations. They've spent the last 20 years studying how America fights and developing strategies specifically designed to neutralize our advantages. And here's something that should terrify every American. We've never fought a peer competitor in the missile age. Every war we've fought since 1945 has been against adversaries who couldn't strike our forward bases, our aircraft carriers, our logistics hubs with precision weapons. China can do all of those things. They have anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically designed to target carrier groups. They have cruise missiles that can hit our bases in Japan and Guam. They have the ability to contest our dominance in space and in cyberspace, domains that our entire military depends on for communication, navigation, and intelligence. But even if we could win such a conflict militarily, even if we could prevent China from taking Taiwan, what would victory actually look like? How many American ships would we lose? How many aircraft? How many lives? And what would be the economic cost of such a war? Because this brings us to the financial dimension of the trap, and this is where things get really dark. The United States economy is currently running on roughly $2 trillion in deficit spending every year. Our national debt is approaching $36 trillion. The interest on that debt is now over $1 trillion annually, which means we're paying more in interest than we spend on defense. We're able to sustain this because the dollar remains the global reserve currency, because treasury bonds are still seen as safe assets, because the world still has faith in American economic stability. But that faith isn't unlimited, and it isn't unconditional. A war with China would shatter the economic assumptions that allow our current system to function. Trade between the United States and China would cease immediately. Global supply chains would rupture. The cost of consumer goods would explode as manufacturing concentrated in China became unavailable. Energy prices would spike as markets panicked about the security of oil shipments through the South China Sea. The stock market would crash as investors fled to safety. And in that environment of economic chaos, who's going to keep buying US Treasury bonds at rates we can afford? This is the checkmate scenario that I don't think enough people are considering. If we go to war over Taiwan, we might win the battle and lose everything else. We could successfully prevent China from taking the island while simultaneously triggering an economic crisis that destroys the dollar's reserve status, that sends inflation spiraling out of control, that forces us to make choices between funding the military and funding social security, between servicing the debt and maintaining basic government functions. And China knows this. They've studied our economy. They hold over $800 billion in US treasuries. They've seen how dependent we've become on cheap manufactured goods, on global supply chains, on financial engineering, and deficit spending. They know that our economy is far more fragile than our military, and that economic warfare might achieve their objectives without firing a shot. Consider what happens if China doesn't invade Taiwan, but simply blockades it. They declare an air defense identification zone around the island. They stop ships from entering or leaving Taiwanese ports. They cut the underwater cables that carry Taiwan's internet traffic. They don't attack anything. They just isolate the island and wait. What does America do in that scenario? Do we sail warships through the blockade and risk starting a shooting war? Do we impose sanctions on China, knowing that this will devastate our own economy? Do we try to rally international support, even though most of our allies are even more economically dependent on China than we are? This is the beauty of the trap from China's perspective. They don't need to win a war. They just need to create a situation where America's choices are all bad, where every option leads to strategic decline, where the cost of maintaining our commitments exceeds our ability to pay. And Taiwan is the perfect trigger for this scenario because we've made such explicit commitments to defend it, because the technology dimension makes it economically critical, because the geographic reality makes it militarily defensible only at enormous cost. Now let's talk about the domestic political dimension, because this is what makes the trap truly inescapable. The American foreign policy establishment, the think tanks, the defense contractors, the media commentators, they've all committed themselves to the position that Taiwan must be defended at all costs. This is bipartisan consensus. Republicans and Democrats both talk tough on China. Both parties have backed Taiwan. Both parties have approved weapons sales and security commitments. No major political figure can now back away from Taiwan without being accused of appeasement, of weakness, of abandoning our allies. This means that when the crisis comes, the political pressure to intervene will be overwhelming, regardless of the strategic wisdom of doing so. The cable news networks will show footage of Chinese forces approaching Taiwan. They'll interview Taiwanese officials pleading for help. They'll bring on retired generals explaining how American credibility is on the line. The defense contractors will fund think tanks that publish papers on why we must act. The politicians will compete to see who can sound toughest on China. And in that environment, making the rational calculation that the costs of intervention outweigh the benefits becomes politically impossible. This is exactly what happened with Ukraine, by the way. We sleepwalked into a commitment to support Ukraine against Russia, driven more by moral outrage and political posturing than by careful strategic analysis. And now we're stuck, having spent over $100 billion supporting a war that we can't really win, but can't afford to lose, because we've made it a test of American resolve. The Taiwan situation will be Ukraine multiplied by 10 in terms of the stakes, the costs, and the risks. And here's what really keeps me up at night. China doesn't even need to move on Taiwan to spring the trap. The mere threat, the constant tension, the ongoing military buildup, all of this forces us to spend resources, to maintain commitments, to position forces in ways that drain our strength and divert our attention from other challenges. We're building up our military presence in the Pacific, which means we have less capacity for Europe, for the Middle East, for our own hemisphere. We're spending billions on weapons systems specifically designed for a China conflict, which means less money for everything else. We're focused on the Taiwan scenario, while China builds influence in Africa, in Latin America, in Central Asia, through economic investment and development projects. This is strategic exhaustion by 1,000 cuts. China doesn't need to fight us directly. They just need to force us to maintain commitments that we can't sustain, to defend positions that are inherently untenable, to spend resources that we don't have on scenarios that benefit them regardless of the outcome. And Taiwan is the perfect vehicle for this strategy because it combines maximum American commitment with maximum Chinese advantage in geography, in economics, and in resolve. Because let's be honest about something that's uncomfortable to acknowledge. Taiwan matters more to China than it does to the United States. For China, Taiwan is about national unity, about reversing what they see as a historical injustice from their century of humiliation, about demonstrating that China has returned to great power status. For the United States, Taiwan is about maintaining credibility, about semiconductors, about naval dominance in a region that's important but not existential to our survival. In a contest of wills, the side with more at stake usually wins, and China has far more at stake in Taiwan than we do. This doesn't mean China will necessarily invade or that conflict is inevitable. What it means is that we've positioned ourselves in a situation where we have no good options, where we're committed to defending something we can't easily defend, against an adversary that's willing to pay almost any price to achieve their objective, in a theater where every advantage lies with them. This is the definition of a strategic trap, and we're standing right in the middle of it. And the scary part is that I'm not sure we have any way out that doesn't involve either unacceptable compromise or unacceptable risk.